In early 2013, as Islamic extremists from Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and Ansar Dine seized control of Timbuktu in northern Mali, one of the world's great repositories of ancient knowledge faced imminent destruction. The city's libraries contained approximately 377,000 medieval manuscripts documenting African history, Islamic scholarship, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and poetry dating back to the 13th century, manuscripts that proved African intellectual achievement, challenged European narratives about African history, and represented irreplaceable primary sources about medieval West African civilization. The extremists had already begun destroying shrines and artifacts they considered un-Islamic, and everyone knew the manuscripts would be next. Standard procedure would be to notify UNESCO, wait for international intervention, and hope the manuscripts survived the occupation. Instead, Abdelkader Haidara, a mild-mannered librarian and manuscript collector, organized an underground network that spent months secretly packing 377,000 manuscripts into metal trunks, smuggling them out of Timbuktu in cars, donkey carts, and canoes, and hiding them in private homes across southern Mali. When the extremists finally torched the Ahmed Baba Institute expecting to destroy Mali's intellectual heritage in one dramatic fire, they found the building empty. The manuscripts were already 600 miles away, saved by a conspiracy of librarians, scholars, and ordinary Malians who risked their lives to move boxes of old paper. Here's what makes this story both inspiring and revealing. Haidara wasn't a government official with resources and authority. He was a private manuscript collector and librarian with no official power to organize a national rescue operation. The people who helped him weren't trained operatives but truck drivers, boat operators, and ordinary citizens who understood that these manuscripts mattered more than their own safety. The international community offered words of concern but little practical help until after the manuscripts were already saved. And most remarkably, the operation succeeded not through sophisticated planning but through improvisation, community networks, and the kind of courage that comes from understanding that some things are worth dying for. The story reveals that cultural heritage is ultimately saved, not by institutions or governments but by individuals who care enough to take personal risks, that the most important rescue operations are often organized by ordinary people, without official authorization, and that knowledge is only as safe as the commitment of those who hold it. Welcome to History Unleashed, where we explore how ordinary people preserve civilization in extraordinary circumstances. I'm your host, and today we're investigating how librarians, archivists, and scholars have repeatedly saved national and cultural knowledge from destruction, where we'll discover the multiple times entire libraries and archives were rescued by individuals acting without official support. Explore what makes people risk their lives to save books and manuscripts. Examine the pattern of cultural destruction in warfare and occupation, and the pattern of resistance to that destruction. Investigate what was actually at stake in these rescues beyond just old books. Understand why cultural heritage destruction is a deliberate strategy in modern conflicts, and reveal what these stories teach us about what knowledge means, who is responsible for preserving it, and why librarians are often unsung heroes of civilization. If you're ready to discover that the Timbuktu manuscript rescue involved metal trunks hidden under women's clothing in trucks, driving through rebel checkpoints, that during the siege of Sarajevo, librarians formed human chains under sniper fire to rescue books from a burning library, that Baghdad's National Library was saved by librarians who hid books in their homes during the Iraq War, that the Nazi book burnings were resisted by librarians who secretly preserved banned books, and that in every case of cultural destruction, there are individuals who risk everything to save what they can. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we're about to explore reveals both the best of human nature and the importance of cultural heritage that transcends immediate survival. So prepare yourself for a journey into acts of cultural heroism, where we'll discover that saving knowledge often requires individual courage and defiance of authority, and where librarians emerge as unlikely heroes willing to die for ideas, history, and memory. Chapter 1. The Manuscripts of Timbuktu. How one man saved 377,000 pieces of history. The story of how Abdelkader Haidara saved the manuscripts of Timbuktu from Al-Qaeda is both an adventure story of daring rescue and a meditation on what makes people risk their lives for pieces of old paper, revealing the profound connection between cultural heritage and identity. the way ordinary people become heroes when civilization is threatened, and the reality that the most important preservation work is often done by individuals acting without official authority or resources. Understanding who Hydra is, what the manuscripts actually are and why they matter, how the rescue was organized and executed, what risks the participants took, and why the international community failed to help until after the rescue was complete provides both an inspiring story and uncomfortable questions about who is actually responsible for preserving humanity's cultural heritage. Abdelkader Haidara was born in 1955 in Timbuktu to a family of scholars and manuscript custodians. His father, Muhammad Mahmud Haidara, was a manuscript collector and Islamic scholar, and young Abdelkader grew up surrounded by ancient texts. He trained as a Quranic scholar, but became increasingly interested in the historical manuscripts that families in Timbuktu had preserved for centuries. In the 1980s, he began working for the Ahmed Baba Institute of Higher Learning and Islamic Research, helping to catalog and preserve Timbuktu's manuscripts. He also built his own collection, the Mama Haidara Memorial Librarian, which held approximately 7,000 manuscripts, inherited from his family and acquired from other families in the region. The manuscripts themselves are extraordinary documents that challenge Western narratives about African history and demonstrate the sophistication of medieval West African intellectual life, dating from the 13th to the early 20th centuries. The manuscripts cover subjects including Islamic theology and jurisprudence, history, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, chemistry, poetry, and everyday life. They document the Mali and Songhai empires, the trans-Saharan trade, Islamic scholarship in West Africa, and the daily concerns of medieval Timbuktu society. They're written primarily in Arabic, but also in Fulani, Songhai, and other African languages, using African papermaking techniques and distinctive West African calligraphic styles. The historical importance of the manuscripts lies partly in what they prove about African intellectual achievement. For centuries, European narratives suggested that sub-Saharan Africa had no written history, no sophisticated scholarship, and no significant intellectual traditions. The Timbuktu manuscripts decisively refute these claims, demonstrating that West Africa had vibrant literate culture, sophisticated scholarship, and intellectual networks connecting it to the broader Islamic world and beyond. The manuscripts include advanced mathematical texts, astronomical treatises showing accurate calculations, medical documents demonstrating sophisticated understanding of disease and treatment, and historical chronicles providing primary source documentation of African history from African perspectives. The ownership structure of the manuscripts is significant for understanding how they survived and how Haidara organized their rescue. While some manuscripts were held by the Ahmed Baba Institute and other official institutions, the majority were family property, passed down through generations of families who understood themselves as custodians of their ancestors' intellectual heritage. This distributed ownership meant the manuscripts were scattered across Timbuktu in hundreds of private homes and family libraries, making them difficult for officials to catalog or control, but also difficult for destroyers to find and eliminate. Haidara's rescue operation would depend on these family networks and on convincing individual owners to entrust their family treasures to the rescue effort. The crisis began in 2012 when Tuareg rebels and Islamic extremists including Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, AQM, and Ansar Dine seized control of northern Mali, including Timbuktu. Initially, the rebels presented themselves as liberators from an oppressive central government, and many in Timbuktu hoped the occupation would be brief. But the extremists quickly imposed strict Sharia law, banned music, destroyed shrines and mausoleums they considered un-Islamic, and began threatening the manuscripts. The extremists viewed the manuscripts, particularly those dealing with Sufism and local Islamic traditions, as heretical. They had already destroyed manuscripts in other locations and had threatened that Timbuktu's manuscripts would be next. Haidara recognized immediately that the manuscripts were in mortal danger and that waiting for international intervention would be too slow. He began organizing a rescue operation in late 2012, working with other manuscript collectors, librarians, and community members. The operation had to be completely secret because if the extremists discovered what was happening, they would immediately destroy the manuscripts and probably kill everyone involved. The plan was simple but extraordinarily risky. Pack the manuscripts into metal trunks, smuggle them out of Timbuktu using whatever transportation was available, and hide them in southern Mali until the crisis ended. The logistics were daunting. The manuscripts were extremely fragile. Some were over 700 years old, the paper was brittle, the ink was fading, and they required careful handling to avoid damage. But careful packing took time they didn't have, and there was no way to evacuate 377,000 manuscripts using professional conservation techniques. They had to choose between perfect preservation and losing everything. They chose survival over perfection, packing manuscripts as carefully as possible in metal trunks designed to protect from moisture and rough handling, but knowing that some damage was inevitable. The transportation methods had to be improvised and varied to avoid detection. Some manuscripts left Timbuktu hidden in cars and trucks, often concealed under goods or hidden in compartments. The trucks had to pass through rebel checkpoints where searches were common, and discovery would mean death for the drivers and destruction of the manuscripts. Some drivers hid metal trunks under loads of dried fish or other goods. Women sometimes helped by hiding smaller packages of manuscripts under their clothing, exploiting the rebels' reluctance to search women too thoroughly. Some manuscripts traveled by donkey cart on back roads to avoid checkpoints. Others went by canoe down the Niger River, a slow and difficult journey, but one that avoided rebel-controlled roads. The risks were extraordinary for everyone involved. The drivers knew they would be killed if caught. The boat operators knew the same. The families who entrusted their ancestral manuscripts to the operation were taking a leap of faith that their family treasures wouldn't simply disappear or be destroyed in transit. Haidara himself was coordinating an illegal operation under the noses of extremists who would gladly kill him, and everyone helping him. The stress of maintaining secrecy while organizing such a large operation was enormous. One mistake, one betrayal, one unlucky checkpoint search would mean catastrophe. The financing of the operation was initially personal and local. Haidara and the manuscript-owning families funded the early stages themselves, paying for metal trunks, transportation, and safe houses in the south. As the operation continued, some international organizations began providing financial support, but this help came slowly and bureaucratically, while the danger was immediate. The early stages of the rescue depended entirely on local resources and the willingness of Malians to spend their own money to save. Their cultural heritage, the storage locations, in southern Mali were private homes belonging to supporters of the rescue. The manuscripts couldn't be stored in official buildings because the extremists had sympathizers throughout the country who might report the locations. Spreading the manuscripts across multiple private locations meant that even if one cache was discovered, the others would survive. The homeowners who agreed to store thousands of manuscripts in their houses were taking significant risks. If discovered, they would face punishment as traitors to the extremist cause. But they understood the importance of what they were protecting and accepted the danger. The close call came in January 2013 when French forces intervened to drive the extremists from Timbuktu. As the extremists fled, they began destroying what they could, including attempting to burn the Ahmed Baba Institute. They set fire to the building expecting to incinerate thousands of manuscripts in one dramatic bonfire. But when they torched the institute, they found it nearly empty. Only about 4,000 manuscripts remained, most of them relatively recent and less valuable. The vast majority had already been evacuated to safety. The extremists had been defeated not by military force but by librarians, scholars, and community members who had outsmarted them. The aftermath revealed both the success and the costs of the operation. Approximately 377,000 manuscripts had been saved, an extraordinary achievement. But the operation had cost enormous amounts of money. The manuscripts had suffered some damage from the hasty packing and rough transportation, and they now needed professional conservation work to repair damage from both the evacuation and from decades of inadequate storage conditions. The safe houses in southern Mali were not climate-controlled archival facilities. They were ordinary homes where manuscripts were stacked in rooms, vulnerable to heat, humidity, and insects. The international response was complicated and revealing. During the crisis, when the manuscripts needed rescue, international organizations offered concern and bureaucratic process, but little immediate practical help. After the rescue, when the manuscripts were safe, international funding appeared for conservation and digitization projects. This pattern suggests that international heritage organizations are better at supporting established projects than at enabling emergency rescue operations. The people who actually saved the manuscripts, Haidara and his network, had to act independently because official channels were too slow and too risk-averse. The recognition Haidara received afterward was substantial but came with complexity. He became internationally famous as the man who saved the Timbuktu manuscripts, receiving awards and speaking at conferences worldwide. But he also faced criticism from some who thought the evacuation was unnecessary or too risky, or who resented that one person received credit for what was truly a community effort. Haidara consistently emphasized that he couldn't have succeeded without the hundreds of people who helped, but the media narrative often simplified the story to one heroic individual. The digitization project that followed the rescue aims to make the manuscripts accessible globally while protecting the originals. Organizations including Google, UNESCO, and various foundations have funded efforts to photograph every page of every manuscript, creating digital copies that can be studied by scholars worldwide, without risking the fragile originals. This democratizes access to knowledge that was previously available only to those who could travel to Timbuktu and gain permission to handle the manuscripts. But it also raises questions about ownership. Who controls the digital copies? Who profits from their distribution? Should the knowledge be freely available, or should the families who preserved it for centuries receive some benefit? The broader lesson from the Timbuktu rescue is that cultural heritage is ultimately preserved by individuals and communities who care enough to take personal risks, not by institutions or international agreements. The manuscript survived because specific people, Haidara, the drivers, the boat operators, the homeowners, the manuscript-owning families, made choices to prioritize cultural preservation over personal safety. No international treaty or UNESCO designation would have saved the manuscripts if these individuals hadn't taken action. This suggests that all the international frameworks for protecting cultural heritage are ultimately dependent on local people being willing and able to do the actual work of preservation. From which country are you watching this? Because cultural heritage preservation depends on local people everywhere, and every country has stories of individuals who saved knowledge from destruction. What examples from your country show similar patterns of ordinary people preserving cultural heritage? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you're inspired by Haidara's courage, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore other examples of librarians and archivists saving knowledge during wartime and occupation. Chapter 2. Librarians Under Fire, from Sarajevo to Baghdad. While the Timbuktu manuscript rescue is the most dramatic recent example of librarians saving cultural heritage from destruction, it's not unique. Throughout modern history, librarians, archivists, and scholars have repeatedly risked and sometimes lost their lives to preserve knowledge during warfare, occupation, and cultural destruction campaigns. These stories reveal a consistent pattern. When cultural heritage is threatened, institutions often fail or are prevented from acting by politics and bureaucracy, leaving individual librarians and community members to organize rescue operations without official support. Facing dangers including bombardment, snipers, looting, and execution as traitors. Understanding these other examples shows that cultural heritage preservation in crisis is almost always a story of individual courage rather than institutional effectiveness, and that librarians are often unsung heroes who understand that civilization depends on preserving memory, knowledge, and culture even when immediate survival seems more pressing. The Siege of Sarajevo from 1992 to 1996 included one of the most dramatic and well-documented examples of librarians acting under fire to save cultural heritage. On August 25, 1992, Serb forces bombarding Sarajevo deliberately targeted the National and University Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina with incendiary shells, setting the building ablaze. The library contained approximately 1.5 million volumes, including irreplaceable manuscripts, rare books, and archives documenting Bosnian history and culture. The bombardment was deliberate cultural destruction. Serb nationalist forces explicitly aimed to erase Bosnian Muslim cultural heritage, believing that destroying libraries, archives, and mosques would eliminate the historical basis for Bosnian identity. The response to the library fire demonstrated extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances. As the building burned, librarians, university students, and ordinary citizens formed human chains, running into the burning building to rescue what they could while sniper fire from surrounding hills targeted people in the streets. They carried books out through smoke and flames, knowing that snipers were deliberately shooting at them, knowing the building might collapse, knowing they might die to save books. Some did die. The rescue effort saved approximately 100,000 volumes, but over 1 million were destroyed. The people who ran into that burning library under sniper fire understood something profound: that a society that loses its memory loses its identity, and that some things are worth dying for even when survival seems more important. The symbolism of the library burning was not lost on anyone involved. Books themselves were becoming projectiles in a war about identity and belonging. As the library burned, witnesses reported that charred pages floated through the air across Sarajevo like black snow, falling on streets and rooftops, a visible symbol of cultural destruction. The Serb forces' deliberate targeting of libraries, archives, and mosques wasn't just collateral damage of war but was central strategy. Cultural genocide attempting to erase the historical evidence of Bosnian Muslim presence and achievement. The librarians and citizens who rescued books were resisting this erasure, asserting that Bosnian culture would survive even if individuals died. The Oriental Institute in Sarajevo suffered a similar fate in May 1992, when it was deliberately shelled and burned, destroying approximately 5,000 manuscripts and 7,000 rare books, documenting Islamic culture in Bosnia. Unlike the National Library, where rescue was partially possible, the Oriental Institute was hit with such intensity that almost nothing could be saved. The director and staff could only watch as centuries of cultural heritage burned. The trauma of witnessing such deliberate destruction of knowledge stayed with the surviving librarians for years, many describing it as watching murder, not of people but of culture, memory, and history. The reconstruction after the war revealed how difficult it is to recover from cultural destruction. The National Library building was eventually rebuilt and reopened in 2014, but the collections lost in 1992 can never be fully replaced. Some materials existed in copies elsewhere and could be recovered, but unique manuscripts, local archives, and rare books were simply gone forever. The rebuilt library functions but contains a different collection than the one that burned. The memory of what was lost haunts those who remember the original library, a permanent scar in Bosnia's cultural heritage. The Iraq War and the looting of Baghdad in 2003 provides another example of librarians acting without official support to save what they could from disaster. As American forces took Baghdad and order collapsed, looters ransacked the National Library and National Archives. Over several days in April 2003, while American forces secured oil facilities and government buildings, the National Library burned and was looted, losing approximately 25% of its collection, including rare manuscripts, Ottoman archives, and historical documents that were unique and irreplaceable. The Iraqi librarians and archivists who tried to protect the collections faced impossible choices. Some stayed in the buildings trying to prevent looting, risking their lives against violent looters. Others, recognizing they couldn't stop the looting, focused on hiding the most valuable materials. Some librarians took manuscripts and rare books to their own homes for safekeeping, effectively stealing from the library to prevent the materials from being destroyed or stolen by looters. This raises interesting ethical questions. Is it theft to take library materials to protect them? The librarians who hid books in their homes were technically violating regulations, but were acting to preserve what they could. Most returned the materials after order was restored, but some materials disappeared, either truly stolen or lost in the chaos. The Baghdad library disaster was partially preventable, which makes it more frustrating. The Pentagon had been warned by numerous experts that cultural sites, including libraries, archives, and museums, would be vulnerable to looting in the chaos following regime change. Lists of sites requiring protection were provided to military planners, but insufficient forces were allocated to guard cultural sites, and the protection that was provided focused on museums rather than libraries and archives. The National Library burned and was looted, while American forces nearby focused on other priorities, suggesting that cultural heritage protection wasn't considered militarily important. The aftermath saw some American soldiers helping Iraqi librarians recover and protect materials, but this assistance came too late to prevent significant losses. The contrast between the careful protection of oil facilities and the neglect of cultural sites suggested to many Iraqis that American forces valued Iraq's oil more than its cultural heritage, contributing to anti-American sentiment and resistance. The lesson is that cultural heritage protection in wartime requires advanced planning, adequate resources, and recognition that winning hearts and minds requires demonstrating respect for local culture and history. The Warsaw libraries during World War II provide an earlier example of librarians acting heroically to preserve knowledge. Nazi occupation policy explicitly targeted Polish culture, attempting to eliminate Polish national identity through cultural destruction. Libraries were ransacked, burned, or had their Polish language materials destroyed. The Nazis intended to preserve German language materials while eliminating Polish intellectual heritage. Polish librarians responded by hiding books in private homes, creating underground libraries, and maintaining secret lending operations despite the death penalty for such activities. The scale of Nazi cultural destruction in Poland was enormous. An estimated 16 million books were destroyed or stolen during the occupation, representing approximately 80% of Poland's library collections. Warsaw's libraries were systematically destroyed, particularly during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, when the city was razed as collective punishment. But even during the destruction, individual librarians hid what they could, memorized catalog systems so they could reconstruct them after the war, and maintained underground intellectual life. The reconstruction of Polish libraries after the war depended heavily on these hidden caches and on the knowledge preserved in librarians' memories of what had existed. The pattern across all these examples is consistent. Deliberate cultural destruction as weapon of war, institutions unable or unwilling to effectively protect heritage, individual librarians and community members taking personal risks to save what they can, improvised rescue operations without official support, and mixed results where some materials are saved, but significant losses occur. This pattern suggests that formal international frameworks for protecting cultural heritage in wartime, including UNESCO conventions and international laws, are largely ineffective because they depend on combatants respecting those frameworks, and combatants engaged in cultural destruction, by definition, don't respect such frameworks. The psychological toll on librarians who witness destruction of the collections they've devoted their lives to preserving is profound and often overlooked. These are professionals who understand the historical value of what's being destroyed, who know specific manuscripts and books personally, and who experience their loss as traumatic. The librarians who watched Sarajevo's library burn, who saw Baghdad's archives looted, who witnessed Warsaw's collections destroyed, often described the experience as devastation comparable to losing family members. This speaks to how deeply they understood the connection between cultural heritage and civilization itself. The question of priorities during wartime: should resources go to feeding people or protecting books? Creates ethical tensions. Critics of cultural heritage protection argue that in war, human survival should take absolute priority, and that worrying about books is a luxury. But the librarians who risked their lives to save books understood that culture and identity are essential to human survival, in ways that transcend immediate physical needs. A society that loses all connection to its past, all its books and records and art, has lost something essential to being human. The choice isn't between people and books, but about what kind of survival we're working toward: mere physical existence or preservation of what makes life meaningful. From which country are you watching this? Because cultural destruction in wartime affects all countries and shows patterns that repeat across conflicts. What examples from your country's history show cultural heritage under threat and the people who tried to save it? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're moved by these stories of librarians under fire, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to explore why cultural destruction is a deliberate strategy and what it tells us about the nature of civilization. Chapter 3. Why they burn books: cultural destruction as strategy. Understanding why groups deliberately target libraries, archives, museums, and cultural sites requires recognizing that cultural destruction is not collateral damage or irrational fanaticism, but calculated strategy with clear political and psychological goals, erasing the historical basis for group identity, eliminating evidence that challenges conquerors' narratives, demoralizing populations by destroying what they value, asserting dominance through demonstrating power over culture and memory. and attempting to make resistance impossible by eliminating the cultural foundations that give people reasons to resist. The pattern of cultural destruction repeats throughout history, from ancient Rome's destruction of Carthage, to Nazi book burnings, to ISIS dynamiting Palmyra, to Serb forces burning Sarajevo's library, and in each case the destruction serves similar purposes, not just eliminating inconvenient records, but attacking the very idea that the targeted group has legitimate history, culture, or right to exist. Understanding the strategic logic of cultural destruction is uncomfortable, because it reveals that burning books and destroying heritage is often rational from the destroyer's perspective, making it more important to understand so it can be anticipated and resisted. The ancient precedent for cultural destruction as strategy appears in Rome's treatment of Carthage in 146 BCE. After defeating Carthage in the Third Punic War, Rome didn't just conquer the city but systematically destroyed it, razing buildings, killing or enslaving the population, and allegedly sowing the earth with salt so nothing would grow. Roman accounts also describe destroying Carthaginian libraries and records, attempting to eliminate Carthaginian culture so thoroughly that only Roman sources would survive to tell the story. This wasn't just revenge, but deliberate cultural genocide. Rome wanted to ensure that Carthage would be remembered only as Rome chose to remember it, not as Carthaginians had recorded themselves. The Spanish destruction of Mayan codices provides another early example of cultural destruction justified by religious ideology. When Spanish conquistadors and Catholic missionaries arrived in Mesoamerica, they encountered sophisticated literate civilizations with libraries of codices documenting history, astronomy, mathematics, and religion. Bishop Diego de Landa ordered the burning of Mayan codices in 1562, destroying virtually the entire corpus of Mayan written knowledge. De Landa justified this as eliminating paganism and devil worship, but the effect was to erase Mayan intellectual achievement and historical memory. Only 3 or 4 Mayan codices survived, making the reconstruction of pre-Columbian Mayan civilization extraordinarily difficult. The Spanish cultural destruction was strategic, eliminating indigenous knowledge systems made indigenous populations more dependent on Spanish authorities for historical, narrative, and cultural identity. The Nazi book burnings of May 10, 1933 provide the most famous modern example of cultural destruction as ideological statement. The burnings targeted books by Jewish authors, communist writers, democratic philosophers, and anyone whose ideas contradicted Nazi ideology. The spectacle was deliberately public. Students and SA paramilitary units burned books in bonfires in university towns across Germany, while crowds cheered. The message was clear. Ideas that contradicted Nazi ideology had no place in the new Germany. The book burnings weren't just destroying specific texts. Most of the burned books existed in other copies elsewhere, but were performative assertions of power over intellectual life and symbolic purging of un-German ideas. The Nazi targeting of Jewish libraries and cultural institutions throughout occupied Europe was more systematic and strategic than the symbolic 1933 burnings. As Germany occupied countries across Europe, special units targeted Jewish libraries, synagogues, archives, and cultural collections, systematically looting or destroying them. The goal was both practical, eliminating records of Jewish property ownership, community organization, and historical presence, and symbolic, attempting to erase Jewish cultural heritage from Europe. Much of what was looted went to Nazi research institutes studying the Jewish problem, showing that cultural destruction served both eliminationist goals and scholarly purposes for researchers justifying genocide. The Chinese Cultural Revolution from 1966-1976 provides an example of cultural destruction as ideological purification within a society rather than against external enemies. Red Guards targeted four-olds and old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas, destroying temples, libraries, artwork, and books representing traditional Chinese culture. The destruction was meant to eliminate pre-communist cultural influences and create a revolutionary society starting from zero. Libraries were ransacked, ancient texts burned, and scholars forced to destroy their own books and research. The scale of destruction was enormous, and the loss of cultural heritage was recognized even by Chinese authorities after the Cultural Revolution ended as a catastrophic mistake. The Taliban's destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001 demonstrated cultural destruction as assertion of religious authority and rejection of pre-Islamic history. The Taliban dynamited the 6th century Buddha statues despite international protests, declaring them idolatrous and un-Islamic. This wasn't just iconoclasm, but statement that Afghanistan's pre-Islamic history was illegitimate and needed to be erased. The destruction was performative. The Taliban filmed and publicized it, showing that the goal was making a statement to both domestic and international audiences about Taliban authority and ideology. The act communicated that Taliban ideology superseded historical preservation and international norms. The ISIS campaign of cultural destruction from 2014-2017 in Iraq and Syria combined multiple motives: ideological justification, destroying pre-Islamic heritage as idolatrous; political messaging, demonstrating power and rejecting international norms; revenue generation, looting and selling artifacts while destroying what couldn't be sold; and strategic demoralization, attacking cultural foundations of Iraqi and Syrian identity. ISIS's destruction of Palmyra, Nimrud, Hatra, and other ancient sites was carefully filmed and publicized, showing that performance for propaganda purposes was as important as the destruction itself. The group understood that destroying ancient sites gained international attention and reinforced its narrative of fundamentally breaking with existing order. The strategic logic of cultural destruction becomes clear when examining what destroyers gain. They eliminate historical evidence that contradicts their narratives. They demonstrate power over the conquered population's most valued possessions. They demoralize resistance by destroying symbols of identity. They create terror by showing willingness to destroy what opponents consider sacred, and they attempt to reshape historical memory to legitimize their own authority. These are rational, strategic calculations from the destroyer's perspective, even if morally reprehensible. Understanding this logic is important because it explains why cultural destruction persists despite international condemnation, and why it's predictable in certain types of conflict. The relationship between cultural destruction and genocide is significant. The UN Convention on Genocide includes causing serious mental harm to members of the group among acts constituting genocide, and systematic cultural destruction arguably qualifies. When Serb forces burned Sarajevo's libraries and destroyed mosques, they were attempting to eliminate the cultural basis for Bosnian Muslim identity, making this cultural genocide accompanying physical violence. Similarly, ISIS's targeting of Yazidi and Christian cultural sites accompanied efforts to physically eliminate those populations. Cultural destruction often precedes or accompanies physical violence because eliminating a group's cultural foundations makes their complete elimination seem more feasible. The psychological dimensions of cultural destruction reveal why it's so effective as a weapon. For many people, cultural heritage provides connection to ancestors, foundation for identity, and sense of historical continuity. Destroying cultural heritage attacks these psychological foundations, creating feelings of helplessness, loss of identity, and disconnection from history. This is why witnesses to library burnings describe trauma comparable to witnessing murder. They're watching the death of culture and memory. The destroyers understand this psychological impact and deliberately target cultural sites to maximize demoralization. The economic motivations for cultural destruction are often overlooked. Looting accompanies many cultural destruction campaigns, with valuable artifacts sold on black markets to fund military operations or enrich commanders. ISIS systematically looted archaeological sites before destroying them, selling artifacts internationally to fund their operations. This creates perverse incentives where cultural destruction becomes profit center. The combination of ideological justification and economic benefit makes cultural destruction particularly attractive to certain groups. The role of modernity and technology in cultural destruction is paradoxical. Modern weapons make destruction easier and more complete. Dynamite can destroy in minutes what took centuries to build. But modern technology also makes documentation and reconstruction more possible. Before destroying Palmyra, ISIS inadvertently enabled preservation by allowing tourists to photograph extensively, creating digital records that might allow eventual reconstruction. The tension between destructive and preservative capabilities of modern technology affects how cultural destruction unfolds and how we respond to it. The distinction between physical and cultural genocide helps clarify what's at stake in cultural destruction. Physical genocide attempts to eliminate a people through killing. Cultural genocide attempts to eliminate a people's identity, culture, and history. Even if individuals survive physically, both can occur simultaneously, but cultural genocide can occur independently, eliminating a culture while allowing individuals to survive as culturally assimilated members of the dominant group. This distinction matters for understanding what cultural destruction aims to accomplish and why resistance to it is important even when physical survival isn't immediately threatened. The question of whether cultural destruction ever serves legitimate purposes is raised by cases where destruction targets oppressive symbols. Should statues honoring colonizers or slave owners be destroyed? Should monuments to oppressive regimes be eliminated? This creates tension between cultural preservation principles and justice concerns. The difference seems to be between destroying culture that represents a group's identity and history versus destroying symbols that represent oppression of that group. Destroying Bosnian libraries eliminates culture. Removing Confederate monuments eliminates symbols of oppression. But the line isn't always clear, and arguments about cultural destruction often involve competing claims about what's being destroyed and why. The failure of international law to prevent cultural destruction shows the limits of legal frameworks without enforcement mechanisms. The 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict prohibits deliberate targeting of cultural sites. The International Criminal Court can prosecute cultural destruction as war crime, but these frameworks depend on combatants respecting international law, and groups engaged in cultural destruction by definition don't respect such frameworks. The prosecution of Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi by the ICC for destroying Timbuktu's shrines was symbolically important, but didn't prevent the destruction or deter others. The media coverage of cultural destruction affects how it's understood and responded to. ISIS's destruction of Palmyra received enormous international media attention, while simultaneous destruction of Iraqi libraries received less coverage. This differential attention reflects biases about what cultural heritage matters and to whom. Ancient archaeological sites visible and comprehensible to international audiences receive more attention than libraries and archives containing local knowledge primarily valuable to local populations. This bias affects both which destructions receive resources for prevention or recovery and which groups receive international sympathy. The role of digitization in mitigating cultural destruction offers partial but incomplete solutions. The Timbuktu manuscripts can be digitized, so knowledge survives even if originals are destroyed. But digitization can't capture everything. The physical object's age, materiality, and historical context matter beyond just the content. A medieval manuscript's calligraphy, paper composition, and physical presence convey information that digital copies lose. Digitization is valuable insurance against complete loss, but isn't equivalent to preserving originals. The priority should be protecting originals while also creating digital backups. The generational trauma of cultural destruction affects communities long after physical reconstruction. Bosniaks who witnessed Sarajevo's library burning carry that trauma. Malians who feared losing the Timbuktu manuscripts retain anxiety about their vulnerability. Iraqi Jews whose communities' libraries were destroyed feel disconnected from their history. This generational trauma affects how communities relate to their heritage, often creating both increased commitment to preservation and anxiety about vulnerability. The psychological recovery from cultural destruction takes generations and is never complete. When losses are irreparable, the strategic implication for defenders of cultural heritage is that protection requires anticipating destruction and preparing response. Haidara's Timbuktu rescue succeeded partly because he anticipated the threat and prepared before destruction began. Effective protection requires identifying vulnerable heritage, planning evacuation or hiding procedures, organizing networks of people willing to help, and securing resources before crisis hits. Waiting for crisis to develop and then responding is often too late. The lesson is that cultural heritage protection requires proactive risk assessment and contingency planning, not just reacting to disasters after they occur. From which country are you watching this? Because cultural destruction affects all countries, and understanding why it happens helps anticipate and resist it. What examples from your country show cultural destruction and the strategic purposes it served? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you understand better why cultural destruction is deliberate strategy, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore what was actually in the rescued materials and why specific contents matter. Chapter 4. What was actually saved, beyond just old books moving. Beyond the abstract concept of cultural heritage to examine what the rescued manuscripts, books, and archives actually contained and why those specific materials mattered, reveals that the rescues saved concrete knowledge about history, science, literature, daily life, and identity that would have been permanently lost. Not just symbolic objects, but primary sources enabling us to understand the past and particular cultures in ways that wouldn't otherwise be possible. The Timbuktu manuscripts prove African intellectual achievement in ways that challenge Eurocentric narratives of history. The Sarajevo library materials documented Bosnian cultural distinctiveness that Serb nationalism sought to deny. The Baghdad archives contained records enabling Iraqis to understand their own history, rather than only colonial interpretations. And in each case, the specific content makes these rescues important beyond just preserving something old. Understanding what was actually saved, what knowledge would have been lost, and what specific materials enable us to understand helps explain why people risk their lives for just old books, and reveals that these rescues were about preserving specific knowledge essential for particular communities, identities, and for humanity's collective understanding of history. The Timbuktu manuscripts contain several categories of knowledge that are historically and culturally significant in specific ways. The astronomical texts include sophisticated calculations of planetary movements, eclipse predictions, and star catalogs that demonstrate West African astronomers' mathematical abilities and observational precision. These texts prove that sophisticated astronomical knowledge existed in sub-Saharan Africa centuries before European contact, challenging narratives that portrayed Africans as primitive or lacking scientific capabilities. Some manuscripts describe astronomical instruments and techniques for celestial observation, showing that West African scholars had both theoretical knowledge and practical observational methods. The mathematical manuscripts from Timbuktu include advanced arithmetic, geometry, and algebra texts that parallel developments in other Islamic mathematical traditions. Some manuscripts deal with practical mathematics for commerce, taxation, and land measurement, showing how abstract mathematical knowledge was applied to everyday problems. The mathematical texts demonstrate that West African scholars were part of the broader Islamic mathematical tradition that preserved and expanded Greek and Indian mathematics during Europe's medieval period. These manuscripts provide evidence that Africa contributed to rather than just received mathematical knowledge from other civilizations. The medical manuscripts contain treatments for diseases, surgical procedures, pharmacology using local plants, and theoretical understanding of human anatomy and physiology. Some texts describe specific diseases endemic to West Africa and treatments developed through local experience. The medical knowledge shows sophisticated understanding of disease causation, diagnostic procedures, and therapeutic interventions. These texts are valuable both historically, documenting pre-colonial African medical knowledge, and potentially practically, as some traditional treatments described might yield insights for modern pharmacology. The loss of these manuscripts would have eliminated primary documentation of African medical knowledge. The historical chronicles and the Timbuktu manuscripts provide primary source documentation of West African history from African perspectives, rather than only from Arabic or European sources. The Tariq al-Sudan and Tariq al-Fatash, two major historical works preserved in Timbuktu, document the Mali and Songhai empires, describing political events, social organization, economic activities, and cultural practices. These chronicles enable historians to understand West African history in ways that wouldn't be possible from only external sources. They provide African voices describing their own societies rather than only colonial or Arabic descriptions of Africa. The legal manuscripts document Islamic jurisprudence as practiced in West Africa, showing how Islamic law was adapted to local contexts and how local customary law was integrated with Sharia. These texts are important for understanding how Islamic societies functioned in West Africa and how African Muslims interpreted and applied religious law. The manuscripts show that West African Islamic practice was sophisticated and locally adapted, not just derivative of Middle Eastern Islam. This challenges narratives that portray African Islam as peripheral or unsophisticated. The poetry and literature manuscripts preserve West African literary traditions in Arabic and African languages. The poetry documents everyday life, social relationships, love, loss, religious devotion, and political commentary in medieval and early modern West Africa. These literary works are valuable both as art, the poetry has aesthetic and emotional power, and as historical sources documenting how people thought and felt. The loss of this literature would have eliminated African voices from the historical record and would have made West African cultural history much thinner and less nuanced. The correspondence and everyday documents in the Timbuktu manuscripts include letters between scholars, business contracts, marriage agreements, property records, and other documents of daily life. These mundane documents are historically valuable because they show how ordinary people lived, what they cared about, how they organized their affairs, and how society functioned beyond the elite levels documented in formal histories. The everyday documents humanize West African history, showing that medieval Africans had similar concerns, emotions, and social relationships as people elsewhere, challenging dehumanizing colonial narratives. The significance of the Timbuktu manuscripts for African and global history lies partly in what they prove about pre-colonial African intellectual and cultural achievement. Centuries of European colonialism promoted narratives claiming that Africans had no written history, no sophisticated culture, and no intellectual traditions worth preserving. The manuscripts decisively refute these claims, demonstrating that West Africa had vibrant literate culture, sophisticated scholarship, and intellectual networks connecting it to the broader Islamic world and beyond. The manuscripts prove that European narratives of African primitiveness were racist propaganda rather than accurate history. The materials in Sarajevo's libraries that were destroyed or partially saved included several types of documents significant for Bosnian history and identity. The Ottoman archives documented 4 centuries of Bosnian history under Ottoman rule, including administrative records, tax documents, court proceedings, and correspondence. These archives enabled historians to understand how Ottoman Bosnia functioned, how different communities related to each other, and how Bosnian society developed. The partial loss of these archives created permanent gaps in Bosnian historical knowledge. The manuscripts and rare books in Sarajevo, documenting Bosnian Muslim intellectual and cultural traditions, were specifically targeted because they provided evidence of Bosnian Muslim cultural distinctiveness and historical depth. Serb nationalist ideology claimed that Bosnian Muslims were just Serbs who had converted to Islam and had no legitimate separate identity. The manuscripts documenting centuries of Bosnian Muslim intellectual, religious, and cultural activity contradicted this narrative, which is why Serb forces specifically targeted them for destruction. Saving these manuscripts preserved evidence of Bosnian Muslim cultural identity that Serbian nationalism sought to eliminate. The newspapers, periodicals, and modern publications in Sarajevo's libraries documented more recent Bosnian history and cultural development. These collections enabled researchers to understand how Bosnian society evolved through the 19th and 20th centuries, how different communities interacted, and how Bosnian identity developed. The loss of these materials created gaps in understanding modern Bosnian history that can't be fully filled from other sources. The Baghdad National Library and archives contained several categories of materials significant for Iraqi history and identity. The Ottoman administrative records documented Iraq under Ottoman rule, including tax records, court proceedings, administrative correspondence, and census data. These records enabled historians to understand how Ottoman Iraq functioned and how Iraqi society was organized before the modern Iraqi state. The partial loss of these records damaged Iraqi historical research capabilities. The British Mandate period records in Baghdad documented Iraq under British control from 1920–1932, including administrative correspondence, policy documents, and records of British dealings with Iraqi leaders. These materials enabled Iraqis to understand their own modern history and how colonial rule shaped Iraqi institutions and politics. The loss of some of these records made it more difficult for Iraqis to critically examine their own recent history and understand the origins of contemporary political problems. The Iraqi royal era documents, 1932-1958, preserved in Baghdad's archives, documented the formation of modern Iraq, including constitutional development, political conflict, social changes, and cultural evolution during the monarchy period. These records are essential for understanding how modern Iraqi identity developed and how current Iraqi political culture was shaped. The partial loss damaged Iraqi historiography and made it more difficult for Iraqis to understand their own recent past. Of the Ba'ath Party records and modern Iraqi government documents in Baghdad's archives documented Iraq's recent history under various regimes. While some might argue these should be destroyed as records of oppressive regimes, historians recognize that even records of oppression are historically valuable for understanding what happened, documenting crimes, and enabling accountability. The loss or destruction of these records made it more difficult to document Ba'ath regime crimes and to understand contemporary Iraqi politics and society. The significance of what was saved versus lost in each case reveals patterns about what gets preserved. Materials that existed in multiple copies or that had been microfilmed or digitized before destruction could be partially recovered. Materials that were unique, original manuscripts, local archives, rare books existing in only one or few copies, suffered irreparable loss when destroyed. The lesson is that preservation requires creating copies and distributing materials across multiple locations so that destruction of one site doesn't eliminate knowledge entirely. The practical uses of the saved materials extend beyond pure historical research to supporting contemporary identity, enabling cultural continuity, facilitating education, and supporting political claims. The Timbuktu manuscripts enable West Africans to teach their own history from African sources rather than only from colonial or European accounts. The surviving Sarajevo materials enable Bosnian Muslims to document their cultural heritage against nationalist claims that they have no legitimate separate identity. The surviving Baghdad materials enable Iraqis to understand their own history rather than only knowing it through colonial interpretations. The digitization of rescued materials after crisis has made much previously rare knowledge widely accessible. The Timbuktu manuscripts, once accessible only to scholars who could travel to Timbuktu and gain permission to handle fragile originals, are now being digitized and made available online. This democratizes access to knowledge that was previously effectively restricted to elites. But digitization also raises questions about ownership, control, and benefit. Who owns the digital copies? Who profits from their use? Should the knowledge be freely available, or should the communities who preserved it receive compensation? The recovery of knowledge through oral history and reconstruction after destruction shows how resilient knowledge can be when embedded in communities. After Warsaw's libraries were destroyed, Polish scholars reconstructed some knowledge from memory and from materials that had been hidden or looted and later recovered. But oral history is imperfect. Memories fade, die with individuals, and can be distorted. The permanent loss, when unique, written records are destroyed, can't be fully compensated by oral history or reconstruction. The distinction between content and context affects what's lost when originals are destroyed, even if content is preserved through copies. A medieval manuscript's content might be preserved in modern printed editions, but the physical manuscript itself conveys information about when it was made, who made it, what materials were used, how it was transmitted, who owned it, and countless other contextual details. Digital or print copies preserve content but lose context. This is why preserving originals matters even when content is available elsewhere. The emotional and symbolic significance of original materials to communities extends beyond their informational content. The Timbuktu manuscripts are important partly because their objects ancestors created and preserved, creating tangible connection to the past. The Sarajevo library materials mattered partly because they were physical evidence of Bosnian cultural history, not just information that could be replaced with copies. This emotional significance is why people risk their lives to save originals even when copies might exist. The original object has significance beyond just the information it contains. From which country are you watching this? Because understanding what's actually in rescued cultural heritage rather than just abstractly preserving culture helps explain why specific rescues matter and what's at stake when destruction threatens. What rescued cultural materials from your country contain knowledge that would have been permanently lost? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you understand better why specific contents matter, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to explore the pattern of institutional failure and individual heroism in cultural preservation. Chapter 5. Who is responsible? The failure of institutions and the heroism of individuals examining. The pattern across multiple cultural heritage rescue stories reveals an uncomfortable but consistent reality. International organizations, governments, and official institutions systematically fail to effectively protect cultural heritage during crises, while individual librarians, archivists, and community members repeatedly step up to organize rescue operations without official support, often facing dangers that institutions are unwilling or unable to address, suggesting that our entire framework for cultural heritage protection is fundamentally flawed and relies on individual heroism to compensate for institutional inadequacy. Understanding why UNESCO, governments, military forces, and heritage organizations consistently fail to prevent or respond effectively to cultural destruction. What structural problems prevent institutions from acting quickly and decisively during crises? Why individuals repeatedly must act without official authorization to save heritage? What this reveals about where responsibility actually lies, and what changes are needed to make cultural preservation more effective, requires examining institutional limitations, bureaucratic inertia, political constraints, and the disconnect between international frameworks and on-the-ground reality. The UNESCO Framework for Cultural Heritage Protection illustrates the gap between international aspirations and practical effectiveness. The 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict established principles that warring parties should respect cultural sites, should not target them deliberately, and should take precautions to avoid damage. The 1972 World Heritage Convention created the World Heritage List, designating sites of outstanding universal value that the international community pledges to protect. These frameworks are legally binding on signatory states and create international obligations to protect cultural heritage, but the practical effectiveness of UNESCO frameworks is severely limited by several factors. First, the frameworks depend on voluntary compliance by nations and armed groups who often have incentives to violate them. UNESCO can designate a site as World Heritage, but it can't prevent a warring party from destroying it if destruction serves that party's strategic interests. Second, UNESCO has no enforcement mechanism. It can document violations, issue statements condemning destruction, and potentially refer cases to international courts, but it can't stop destruction in progress or punish violators effectively. Third, UNESCO operates on diplomatic timelines that are far too slow for emergency response. By the time UNESCO organizes meetings, passes resolutions, and coordinates international response, the cultural heritage is often already destroyed. The failure of international institutions to prevent the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas in 2001 exemplifies these limitations. UNESCO, the international community, and various governments pleaded with the Taliban not to destroy the statues. UNESCO offered to move the statues to safe locations or to provide international protection. But the Taliban rejected all appeals and destroyed the statues, while the international community watched helplessly. UNESCO could document the crime and condemn it, but couldn't prevent it because the Taliban didn't recognize UNESCO's authority, and the international community wasn't willing to intervene militarily to protect statues. The inadequacy of military cultural property protection reveals how low cultural heritage ranks in military priorities. Despite international law requiring protection of cultural sites, military forces rarely allocate sufficient resources or attention to cultural protection. In Iraq in 2003, American forces were briefed on cultural sites, but insufficient troops were allocated to guard them. When the National Museum and National Library were looted, American forces nearby didn't respond effectively because they were focused on other priorities. The military calculation was that force protection, controlling insurgent activity, and securing strategic assets like oil facilities were more important than guarding museums and libraries. The structural problem is that militaries are organized and trained for combat, not for cultural protection. Guards for cultural sites must understand what they're protecting, recognize threats, and know appropriate responses. This requires specialized training that most military forces don't provide. Additionally, military planning prioritizes tactical and strategic objectives, and cultural protection is rarely among primary objectives. Unless cultural protection is explicitly prioritized at highest levels of command and is allocated sufficient resources, it will be neglected in favor of other military priorities. The government failure patterns show that even when governments nominally support cultural preservation, they often fail to provide adequate resources or authority for preservation during crises. The Malian government in 2012-2013 was unable to protect the Timbuktu manuscripts because it had lost control of northern Mali to rebels. But even before the crisis, the government had provided insufficient resources for manuscript conservation, leaving much preservation work to private collectors like Haidara. This pattern repeats. Governments acknowledge cultural heritage importance rhetorically, but don't prioritize it in budget allocation or crisis planning. The political constraints on cultural heritage protection during conflict are substantial. When nations are deciding whether to intervene in conflicts, cultural heritage protection is rarely among stated justifications and is almost never sufficient reason for intervention on its own. The international community intervened in Mali in 2013 primarily because of terrorism and regional stability concerns, not because of manuscript threats. The manuscripts benefited from the intervention, but they weren't the reason for it. This political reality means that cultural heritage endangered in conflicts where intervention isn't otherwise justified will likely be lost. The funding structure for cultural heritage creates perverse incentives where money is available for established projects but not for emergency response. International heritage organizations have budgets for ongoing conservation, research, and documentation projects that are planned years in advance. But emergency funding for rescue operations is difficult to obtain because it requires going outside normal budget cycles and justifying unplanned expenditures. This is why Haidara had to fund much of the Timbuktu rescue personally before international support arrived. The international organizations that theoretically care about manuscripts couldn't quickly release emergency funds. The bureaucratic inertia of heritage organizations prevents rapid response to emerging threats. International organizations operate through committees, requiring consensus among member states, following diplomatic protocols, and adhering to bureaucratic procedures. This works reasonably well for planned projects, but is catastrophically slow for emergency response. By the time an international organization organizes emergency meetings, passes resolutions, coordinates member state responses, and allocates funding, the cultural heritage is often already destroyed. The organizational structure optimized for steady-state operations fails during crises requiring rapid improvised response. The risk aversion of official institutions prevents them from supporting necessary but dangerous preservation work. When Haidara was smuggling manuscripts out of Timbuktu through rebel-controlled territory, international organizations couldn't officially support the operation because it involved breaking laws, working with smugglers, and taking enormous risks. Official organizations can't acknowledge supporting illegal activities even when those activities are morally justified and practically necessary. This means that the riskiest preservation work, the work that most needs doing during crises, must be done by individuals acting outside official channels. The pattern of individual heroism compensating for institutional failure appears consistently across cultural heritage rescue stories. Haidara organized the Timbuktu rescue because official channels were too slow and ineffective. Sarajevo librarians ran into burning buildings because no one else would. Baghdad librarians hid materials in their homes because they couldn't wait for official protection. Polish librarians maintained underground libraries because official institutions were destroyed. In each case, individuals recognized that waiting for official response meant losing everything. So they acted without authorization, taking personal risks that institutions were unwilling to accept. The moral responsibility question becomes sharp. If institutions systematically fail to protect cultural heritage, who is responsible for preservation? The legalistic answer is that under international law, states are responsible for protecting cultural property in their territory and are obligated not to deliberately destroy such property. But legal responsibility doesn't ensure effective protection. The practical answer is that preservation depends on whoever cares enough to take action, usually local librarians, archivists, and community members who understand what's at risk and are willing to act. The ethical dimension involves whether individuals have obligations to risk themselves for cultural preservation. No one can be obligated to die for books, but many librarians and archivists clearly feel moral obligations to protect the collections entrusted to them, often describing their work in terms of duty to ancestors who created the materials and duty to future generations who will need them. This sense of professional and moral obligation drives individuals to take risks that rational self-interest would avoid. The question is whether this should be expected of heritage professionals or whether society should provide better institutional support so individual heroism isn't necessary. The economic inequality in cultural heritage protection reveals that wealthy institutions in wealthy countries have resources for preservation that poorer institutions and countries lack. The Getty Conservation Institute, the British Library, the Library of Congress, and other wealthy institutions have resources for conservation, digitization, and emergency response that institutions in Mali, Bosnia, or Iraq cannot match. This creates situations where cultural heritage in poorer countries is more vulnerable, and where wealthy institutions must decide whether to provide assistance. The Timbuktu manuscripts benefited from international support after the rescue, but that support came slowly and after locals had already done the dangerous rescue work. The colonial legacy complicates cultural heritage preservation in formerly colonized countries. Many African and Asian countries had cultural materials looted during colonial periods, leaving their cultural heritage diminished, while European museums hold materials that could be repatriated. This creates resentment and complicates cooperation on preservation. Additionally, colonial-era institutions and practices often didn't prioritize local cultural heritage, creating gaps in preservation that persist after independence. Addressing colonial heritage legacy requires repatriation debates, capacity building in formerly colonized countries, and acknowledgement of how colonialism damaged cultural preservation. The proposed reforms to improve cultural heritage protection include several practical changes. First, create rapid response funding mechanisms that can release money within days rather than months for emergency heritage preservation. Second, train military forces specifically in cultural property protection and make it a primary mission rather than an afterthought. Third, support local cultural heritage professionals with training, resources, and protection, rather than expecting them to work without support. Fourth, create international frameworks that can intervene to protect heritage without requiring military intervention for other purposes. Fifth, prioritize digitization and distributed preservation before crises occur so that losses are limited even if originals are destroyed. The technology solutions offer partial improvements but aren't sufficient alone. Digitization creates backup copies of content but doesn't protect original materials and doesn't capture all the information in originals. Satellite monitoring can detect destruction as it occurs but can't prevent it. Digital databases can track cultural property and make stolen materials harder to sell, but don't stop looting. Technology helps, but ultimately protection requires people who care enough to act and institutions that support them in acting. The cultural shift needed is recognizing that cultural heritage protection is everyone's responsibility, not just heritage professionals. Communities need to understand that their cultural materials are valuable and vulnerable. Governments need to prioritize heritage in policy and funding. Military forces need to treat cultural protection as a core mission. International organizations need to create capacity for rapid response, and individuals need to understand that they can and should act to protect heritage when institutions fail. The training and preparation implications suggest that heritage professionals need training, not just in conservation and scholarship, but in emergency response, risk assessment, and crisis management. Librarians and archivists should know how to quickly pack and evacuate materials, should have evacuation plans prepared before crises, should have networks of people willing to help, and should understand how to improvise solutions when perfect preservation isn't possible. This emergency preparedness should be part of professional training rather than something individuals must figure out during crises. The community engagement dimension recognizes that successful preservation depends on communities valuing their heritage and being willing to help protect it. The Timbuktu rescue succeeded partly because Malian communities understood the manuscript's importance and were willing to help smuggle them. Sarajevo's library rescue succeeded partly because ordinary citizens were willing to risk their lives for books. Building this community engagement requires education about why cultural heritage matters, involving communities in preservation work, and ensuring that preserved heritage serves community needs rather than just scholarly or tourism purposes. The ultimate responsibility question is whether cultural heritage protection should be seen as public good requiring collective action or as particular interest that falls to specific professionals and communities. The answer affects resource allocation and institutional design. If cultural heritage is public good, then governments should prioritize it and international communities should provide support. If it's particular interest, then it falls to those who care about specific heritage to protect it themselves. The pragmatic answer is probably that it's both. Collective responsibility in principle, but individual action in practice when collective action fails. From which country are you watching this? Because institutional failure and individual heroism in cultural preservation appears in all countries, and understanding this pattern helps recognize what changes are needed. What institutional failures in your country have required individual heroism to protect heritage? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you understand better why individuals repeatedly must save heritage when institutions fail, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to conclude with reflections on what these stories teach about civilization, memory, and responsibility. Conclusion or investigation of how librarians saved entire countries. Knowledge has taken us from Abdelkader Haidara's extraordinary rescue of 377,000 manuscripts from Timbuktu through underground networks and improvised smuggling routes, to librarians in Sarajevo forming human chains under sniper fire to rescue books from burning buildings, to the pattern of cultural destruction as deliberate strategy from ancient Rome through Nazi book burnings to ISIS, to understanding what was actually in the rescued materials and why those specific contents mattered for history and identity, and finally to the uncomfortable pattern of institutions systematically failing while individuals repeatedly step up to save cultural heritage through personal heroism. What we've discovered is that civilization's cultural memory depends less on institutions and international frameworks than on individuals who understand that some things are worth risking death for. That knowledge is only as safe as the commitment of those who hold it, and that librarians and archivists are often unsung heroes whose courage and dedication preserve the foundations of culture and identity that make societies more than just collections of individuals. Abdelkader Haidara's story exemplifies the pattern we've explored. An ordinary person recognizing a threat that institutions couldn't or wouldn't address, organizing a rescue operation without official authorization, improvising solutions with whatever resources were available, working through community networks rather than bureaucratic channels, taking personal risks that rational self-interest would reject, and succeeding where official responses would have been too slow to prevent disaster. Haidara wasn't a government official or international expert. He was a librarian and manuscript collector who understood that Mali's intellectual heritage was about to be destroyed and that only immediate local action could save it. The fact that the rescue succeeded through hidden trunks in trucks, manuscripts concealed under women's clothing, donkey cart transport on back roads, and canoes on the Niger River rather than through sophisticated international operation reveals where preservation capacity actually exists. The international community offered concern and eventual funding, but the actual dangerous work of evacuation was done by Malians who understood what was at stake and were willing to risk themselves. This pattern repeats. Sarajevo's librarians, not UN peacekeepers, rescued books from burning buildings. Baghdad's librarians, not American forces, protected materials from looters. Warsaw's librarians, not Allied forces, preserved Polish culture during Nazi occupation. The pattern of cultural destruction as deliberate strategy reveals that burning libraries and destroying heritage is rational from destroyers' perspectives, attempting to erase historical basis for identity, eliminate evidence contradicting conquerors' narratives, demoralize populations, assert dominance, and make resistance impossible. Understanding this strategic logic is uncomfortable because it means cultural destruction isn't just vandalism or fanaticism, but calculated attack on foundations of culture and identity. This makes resistance to cultural destruction essential, not just preserving old objects, but defending the historical memory and cultural foundations that enable communities to maintain identity and resist oppression. The specific contents of rescued materials. The Timbuktu manuscripts proving African intellectual achievement. The Sarajevo materials documenting Bosnian Muslim cultural distinctiveness. the Baghdad archives enabling Iraqis to understand their own history, reveal that cultural heritage rescues save concrete knowledge essential for particular communities and for human understanding of history. These aren't abstract cultural heritage, but specific records enabling specific knowledge that would be permanently lost if destroyed. The Timbuktu manuscripts prove that Africa had sophisticated intellectual traditions. The Sarajevo materials prove that Bosnian Muslims have legitimate separate identity. The Baghdad archives enable Iraqis to understand their recent history. Each rescue preserved specific knowledge that specific communities needed. The institutional failure pattern, UNESCO unable to prevent destruction, militaries inadequately protecting cultural sites, governments providing insufficient resources, international funding arriving too slowly, reveals that our entire framework for cultural heritage protection is inadequate and depends on individual heroism to compensate for institutional failure. This is both inspiring, individuals can make enormous difference, and disturbing. Civilization's memory depends on luck of having right individuals in right places willing to take risks. We cannot continue relying on individual heroism to preserve cultural heritage when institutions systematically fail. The reforms needed include creating rapid response funding, training military forces in cultural protection as primary mission, supporting local heritage professionals, developing capacity for emergency preservation before crises, prioritizing digitization and distributed preservation, and building community engagement so communities value and protect their heritage. But these reforms require recognizing that cultural heritage protection must be prioritized in policy, funding, and military planning, rather than just acknowledged rhetorically. The gap between what we say about cultural heritage importance and how we actually prioritize its protection must close. The moral dimension involves recognizing that cultural heritage is collective good requiring collective responsibility. While we admire librarians who risk death for books, we shouldn't expect such heroism to be necessary. Society should provide institutional support, making heroic self-sacrifice unnecessary for preservation. Heritage professionals should have resources, authority, and protection, enabling them to preserve materials without having to risk themselves. The current system that requires heroism to compensate for institutional failure is unjust to heritage professionals and unreliable for preservation outcomes. The lesson about knowledge preservation is that distributed storage, multiple copies, and active use are more reliable than centralized collections. The Timbuktu manuscripts survived partly because they were distributed across many families, rather than concentrated in one official building. Knowledge survives when it exists in multiple locations and when communities continue using and valuing it. The implication is that preservation strategy should emphasize distribution and community engagement, rather than just building secure, central repositories that become single points of failure. The question of what makes people risk their lives for books reveals values about knowledge, memory, and civilization that transcend immediate survival. The librarians who ran into burning buildings, who smuggled manuscripts through war zones, who maintained underground libraries under occupation, understood that human life is more than just physical survival, that cultural identity and historical memory are essential to meaningful human existence, and that losing connection to past and culture is a form of death even if individuals survive physically. This understanding of culture as essential to human flourishing rather than just optional luxury is what drives people to take risks for preservation. The implications for how we think about civilization suggest that civilizations persist through cultural continuity and memory, more than through political or military power. The Mali and Songhai empires fell centuries ago, but their civilization persists through the manuscripts that preserve their intellectual achievements. Bosnia survived not just through military resistance but through preservation of cultural heritage, proving Bosnian identity. Iraq's identity survived dictatorship, partly through archives documenting Iraqi history. Civilization is fundamentally about maintaining memory, knowledge, and culture across generations, and this maintenance requires active effort and commitment. The role of librarians and archivists as civilization's custodians deserves far more recognition than it typically receives. These professionals, often underpaid and undervalued, maintain the infrastructure of cultural memory. During crises, they repeatedly demonstrate extraordinary courage and commitment to preservation, even when doing so endangers themselves. The stereotype of librarians as quiet bureaucrats pushing books is completely inadequate to capture the reality of heritage professionals who understand their work as essential to civilization and who are willing to die for that. Understanding. The individual agency lesson is that ordinary people can make enormous historical difference through commitment to preservation and willingness to act when institutions fail. Haidara wasn't powerful or famous before organizing the rescue. Sarajevo's librarians were ordinary professionals doing their jobs, but their individual actions in crisis moments preserved cultural heritage that would otherwise have been lost, demonstrating that historical importance doesn't require power or fame but requires being in a position where something needs doing and having courage to do it. The hope from these stories comes from recognizing that even in terrible circumstances, people act to preserve civilization. Under occupation, during war, facing death, individuals and communities organize to save what they can of cultural heritage. This persistent resistance to cultural destruction, this repeated demonstration that people will risk death for books and manuscripts and memory, reveals something profound about human nature, that we understand ourselves as cultural beings whose identity depends on connection to past and whose humanity requires preserving knowledge for future. The responsibility we all bear is to support cultural heritage preservation, not just with admiration for heroic individuals, but with concrete commitment to building institutions and providing resources that make preservation possible without requiring heroism. We should reform international frameworks to enable rapid response. We should train and equip heritage professionals for emergency preservation. We should prioritize cultural protection and military planning. We should fund preservation adequately before crises rather than offering belated support after. We should build community engagement so preservation has local support and participation. The final reflection is that knowledge survives only through commitment. Unlike physical objects that persist without attention, knowledge requires active preservation, copying deteriorating materials, maintaining institutional memory, teaching next generations, using and valuing cultural heritage so preservation remains prioritized. The manuscripts, books, and archives that survived did so because specific people committed to preserving them, often against great odds and at personal cost. Our cultural inheritance exists because generations of librarians, archivists, and scholars made that commitment. We owe them recognition, support, and continuation of their work. Thank you for joining us on this investigation of how librarians saved entire countries' knowledge. If you found this exploration of cultural heroism, institutional failure, and individual courage both inspiring and thought-provoking, make sure you're subscribed to History Unleashed for more investigations into how ordinary people preserve civilization in extraordinary circumstances. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video, and let us know in the comments what other stories of cultural preservation you'd like us to explore. Until next time, remember that civilization's memory depends on individuals willing to risk themselves to preserve it, that librarians and archivists are often unsung heroes of culture and history, that cultural heritage is only as safe as the commitment of those who hold it, and that we all bear responsibility for supporting preservation, so that heroic self-sacrifice isn't necessary for knowledge to survive. Stay committed to preserving knowledge, support your local libraries and archives, recognize that cultural heritage is essential to human flourishing, not just optional luxury, and remember that the books and records and manuscripts we inherit exist because someone cared enough to preserve them. Now it's our turn to preserve them for future generations.